live.
Are we?
Yes.
Okay. All right, we are live. Okay. So much for preparation, because it's still safe here. So we need to go. All right. Thanks. Also with the weird music starting on. I was trying to find a free royalty music, but anyway, you know, that's what's happened with the online events. So hi everybody. My name is Elena Pugia. I'm the founder of the Natives, and we are doing this webinar together in collaboration with ANNA NACKT, a foundation with a very important cause that Alina Klato is going to talk to you a little bit about, and under the auspices of the Global Shapers community, which is an initiative from the World Economic Forum. So we have together here with us some really interesting panelists. I will let them present themselves one by one later. From my side, I would like to actually pass the introduction with the first very important question, which is also the reason why we started this webinar together. So what is cyber violence and how prevalent is it? So Alina, please let us know.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you as well. As Eleanor said, my name is Alina. I'm part of the Global Shapers community of the World Economic Forum, and I'm also one of the initiators of ANNA NACKT. And what is ANNA NACKT? ANNA NACKT is a project that's raising awareness about image abuse and more broadly gender-based cyber violence. We try to provide practical and empathic help for everyone affected by image abuse. So I'm very excited to give you a brief intro into this generally rather big topic. So if any questions come up, please use the Q&A, or if you are dialing in via Facebook or YouTube, you can also just post your comments there. And also, just to be super sure, some of the stories I will be talking about, or we will be talking about today, might trigger someone who experienced cyber violence in the past. So feel free to turn the sound off in between. That's the good news about online meetings. To start off, I wanted to share a few stories with you of women we met through the ANNA NACKT project. We met Anna. Anna is 20 years old. She discovered pictures of herself on Google, pictures of herself naked. Afterwards, she received a dozen messages on Facebook, on Instagram, with very explicit content as well. The pictures were taken down, but as we all know, once on the internet, always on the internet, and she actually just found her pictures again online last week. We also met Emily. Emily is 35, and she has an online stalker. She's getting messages every week on her work phone. She's getting love messages if things go well, and she's getting dick pics if things don't go so well. Also, in her case, she tried to change her number, but we all also know that it's difficult to escape the internet. Lastly, we also met Maya. Maya is 23. She's an activist specifically working on trans issues, and she gets messages whenever she's on Twitter with death threats and rape threats. She tried to contact those platforms, but they are also just saying things like, well, this is just what's happening on the internet. And these are just like a couple of stories, but there are a couple of insights that you get from that when you look at them a bit closer. You see that that cyber violence comes in very different forms and shapes. So it's not only being bullied, or it's not only sharing pictures. It can also be forms of hate speech. And so to give you just a very broad description of what cyber violence means, it means that it's a form of harassment or abuse that is executed using technical aids like emails, phones, and or that takes place in the digital space, like on Instagram, Facebook, etc. A second reality that you see from that, or from these stories, is these are actually not rare cases. These are not like occasional cases that sometimes happen. It's actually a big part of our society that's impacted by cyber violence. In the EU, it's estimated that 1 in 10 women above 15 years old has already experienced a form of cyber violence. And in some cases, like for example, cases of revenge porn or the non-consensual distribution of private pictures, up to 90% of the people affected are women. And lastly, it is actually very lazy to just blame the internet and to then excuse the crimes by saying, well, this is just how the internet works. We have to just keep in mind that it's people who are using the internet. It's people who are bullying, it's people who are stalking, it's people who are sharing images. And it's also people who are designing and managing the very platforms we are just very broadly referring to as the internet. There is a famous quote of Tim Berners-Lee. It's the person who invented the web. And he said, the web is not working for women and girls. And while I agree to that on the surface, I think what we should do today, or what I hope that we will do today, is to dig a little bit deeper and ask the question of why it is that it doesn't work for women and girls, and what needs to change in order to make it a good place for all. So I guess not a small question for us. And that's also why I will stop here and leave the floor to our amazing moderator, Eleanor, and the speakers of today.
Thank you very much, Alina, for the introduction and for setting the tone and the context for this very, very important conversation. Of course, us as the natives, we are partners in this because we understand the importance of data privacy and data security. And at a certain extent, it's important also to increase the data literacy for people to understand exactly how to protect themselves the best, and what kind of flawed systems we have that actually create this type of cyberviolence, and to avoid data leakage. So for us, all of these topics are very much interconnected. And I think, like in the internet age, in the tech age, we're trying to tackling this issue from this angle, from a national to international to a European to a pan-European level. As already Alina informed everybody, and as already advised, anyone who has any comments, wants to share a story with us, wants to ask a question to our panelists, please leave it here in the chat. For the ones who are watching us online on YouTube, we'll be also checking on YouTube regularly to see if anyone has made any comment. So on that note, I would love to invite the panelists who also have a connection and story with this very important and sensitive topic to tell us from their point of view, how exactly can we stop cyberviolence? What do they also do to do that? Eleanor, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elena and Elena, for organizing this. My name is Eleanor Samuelson. I am the co-founder of BrightAct. I also work as an interaction designer, designing technology that brings the user perspective in mind. With BrightAct, we are building an advanced platform that helps municipalities and NGOs to help victims of domestic violence. We are also building an app to help victims get the help and support that they need in one location. It's an app that we've been developing together with the users, asking them what it is that they need and want, and also making sure that we give them the information they need to be able to report incidents that will hold up in court, be able to get in contact with support organizations through our chat, and also to be able to educate themselves on the different forms of violence. Where cyber violence would be one of those forms, but we're also looking into other forms, which could be physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, economical abuse, and any other form of discrimination that happens in the space of violence. I think from my perspective of cyber violence, just to start this conversation off, I see cyber violence as a continuation of the general violence that happens in society, and as a representation of how far we still have to go to reach true equality, and not just equality among the genders, but equality for all human beings, respecting each other's rights, and needs, and also acknowledging that some groups of people need to be supported strongly within this question, and that we need to look at the overall systems and technologies, especially that we build to build a more inclusive world, and also to think about the ways that in which we can collaborate and like cooperate across the multiple levels. So looking into how organizations can collaborate, how governments can collaborate, how victims can get together, and the other layers as well. So I think that would be the perspective that I would want to bring in to this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. Sonia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm actually based in Brooklyn, New York. I'm a strategy consultant by practice, and I'm transitioning to be an entrepreneur focused on building solutions for women in particular, and the use of emerging technologies to do so. I'm in the research and development stage of developing a virtual reality therapy tool for women who have suffered from sexual assault. And excuse me, I'm pausing. Sorry, just got a bit nervous. Yeah, and I think, you know, being introduced to this topic of cyberviolence, so my focus is really focused on physical violence. And what I realized as I started some research on cyberviolence is how nuanced it is, yet there is a relation tied to it from the current violence that exists in person, and how to combat this in the cyber world is to really start democratizing access to the language and to the knowledge that the actors who start the violence use. And that's what my focus on the presentation is today, is also understanding what cybersecurity means for the user. And that's pretty much the area of what I'll be focusing on. Thank you.
Thank you. And Christina, welcome to the conversation.
Hi, yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm Christina. I am coming from a small organization called Netzforma that we founded in Berlin, actually out of different NGOs, women that were engaged there, that dealt with policy here in Berlin. And we kind of thought that somehow in the internet regulation, it comes that the feminist perspective always lacks on especially internet politics and internet laws. And then we founded this little organization in order to focus it and also not to be so dependent on our NGOs that we work in every day. So what is one of our experience is if women come together on the internet, or if we meet and speak to women, we always encounter the topics of hate and of abuse and of cyber violence. That the statistic that Elena mentioned, I would even say the gray scale is a lot higher. So one of our topics is hate speech, and it's kind of interesting because we thought, oh, we do internet politics and we deal with AI and all this regulation, but in the end there's also one topic that comes to us, that is cyber violence, and we need to engage in this conversation because obviously things are not running as well, especially in the sensitivity that in form of hate speech as part of cyber violence, women are kind of left out. We deal a lot with right-wing extremism or all kinds of extremism, but that women are a big part of victims, and that it's in domestic spaces that happens, and technical spaces that happens, that is usually a problem. So what can I say? We have actually a law that went through different procedures or processes of parliament and issuing in the last 2 years. It's called the NetzDG, or Network Enforcement Act, that tries to get people responsible for the abuse that they do, especially hate speech. But as I said, it's very focused on right-wing extremism. And it also comes a bit out of history of Germany, where we feel we have a responsibility to deal with right-wing extremism. And that doesn't make that topic less serious, but it's a problem because women are also affected and they somehow don't have a lobby in this law. And one thing that is actually also very important is that we want a stronger visibility. But one thing that we are dealing right now is that we have spy apps, and these spy apps, they are like a paradise of abuse for women to be controlled by mostly men, stalked, all this kind of, and these spy apps, they are still allowed and they are still totally normal. They even do advertisement if you look on certain web pages of these apps to spy on your girlfriend. Are you jealous? Do you want to do so? So we see that there's already a gender's perspective. So that's also one goal, that we're aiming to deal with that and to sensibilize in order to somehow regulate these spy apps in order to be like, to let women not to be the abuser of these spy apps. That's another law that comes in. So, and what is also very important is, I think, civil society, as a digital civil society, to involve in a conversation, and to make basically everyone be part of the whole procedure and the whole conversation here. Not only platforms or technology or people who develop these technologies, but also and politics who put this into place, but also to make it a topic known to young women, especially. This is part of work, educational work, that is very important to me, to educate them to know their rights. And as we talk about data and data protection, like what does it actually mean, and also ways to get out, which I think ANNA NACKT is a good example. Like, where can I find help? And it's good if you grow up in the internet, then also to know, to have your set of tools, because that is not taught in school or not in an educational way. But we want it to be part of also the educational pedagogic discussion at home, at school, maybe at the social work in the soccer club. I don't know where. So that's it for now, I guess.
For now, just a big task, a huge task. Thank you very much to all the panelists who introduced themselves. There's so many different perspectives, and I'm really trying to figure out how to start. Let me start with summarizing that it's interesting to have 3 different perspectives here in this virtual room. So Christina coming from policymaking and hate speech and really focusing on Germany and Europe. Eleanor, that I've actually had the pleasure to meet through the EU versus Virus community for the hackathon, really trying to help technology, to use technology to help people who suffer from domestic violence, especially the violence that now has risen because of all of us spending a lot of time at home and with people together. And on the other hand, Sonia, who also had a personal personal experience that she's trying to help with people who are suffering with trauma using emerging technologies. So I would like to start this conversation actually and pick up from where you left it, Christina, because you mentioned the law. And I see law, I see technology, I see all of this, let's say, structures of society that we have online and offline as ways for us to create an organism and create a society between us that can function. So last year, several European countries passed a law to ban upskirting. And just last week, Germany passed an update to a law called, very long German word that I'm not going to even fail to pronounce, but something along the Netzwerk durch something. I'm not even going to try anymore, which aims at stopping hate speech, and you mentioned as a form of online violence. So starting with Christina and anyone else, Eleanor, Sonia, continuing, what do you think will change for people affected by cyber violence, and what is still missing to protect people specifically from gender-based cyber violence?
The law is called the Network Enforcement Act, as a translation. Yeah, what the thing is, one thing is the law, Elena, and the other thing is also the practice. So here we have a law that's very, I don't know, I look very deep in it and I see, how do we get everyone to know about this law and that they have a certain right and also certain protection. So just because we have that law in Germany doesn't sometimes make the situation easier. As when we look of the women, and women I mean it's women with a star, like also we have of course transgenders who are affected from that. So if we think of that how can we involve them and how can we make them actually, like how can we get the right to the people who are affected of it? And that's why I think laws is a nice idea, but I want actually the same amount of money that they put into these laws and into education, advertisement, NGOs, and I have this vision of like that we have like a clearing space that people can just, who are affected, go and they can get help, they can get technical help, they can get psychological help there, they can get advice, they can just get like, yeah, as I said, with young women, just get general education to do prevention, all these kind of matters, because what it was mentioned, it's very diverse how it's this violence appears. And also somebody in the end, that's the last question, and then I hand over, is like, what do we do with the perpetrators? We have the victims, but somebody also needs to deal with them. So, and just to block them off the internet might not really solve that problem. And that's what the law does. So that's my critique also of that law, that I think that needs to be more than that.
And what would be the solution then? What would be the more than that? Eleanor, Sonia, would you like to chip in?
I would love to jump in. With Bright Act, we are approaching laws as looking at them as like guidelines for how communities should act. And we're in discussion with multiple layers within society. So we're speaking to NGOs, we're speaking to municipalities, to county governments, to like the national government. And what has become quite obvious within these conversations is that what really is needed is like the data to support that these cases actually happen. And what we're doing then is to, through our like reports, they happen this frequently, they happen within these neighborhoods. And by doing so, we can bring that data to the municipalities, to the NGOs, to like the national governments, so they then can help support these people more effectively. Just today, we were speaking to a municipality who said that their guidelines on how they actually give help to like victims and also to perpetrators, it's dependent on the guidelines coming from the governments. So they do what they can that's based on that like legislation. And then we've also been in discussions with these organizations in Iraq who actually wants to use Bright Act to help pass legislation, because their domestic violence is not a crime. And so one can also then use like the power of collective like reporting to actually bring up like the number of incidents to like the governments and to the county officials and say like, this is real, this is happening, like violence against like women. And we're also taking the approach of like men, we're making our platform very inclusive. So we're not just focusing on like women and like children, but we're trying to help everyone as well, which also enables us then to collect more holistic data, because then we can see what needs and problems everyone within the platform and the system have, and then also help support where it's needed. Because I 100% like agree with you, Christina, that like we shouldn't just be looking to the victims to actually take action, because it's really the victims that should get the like support, and we should get like a community like involvement on the victim. So I almost want to say that we should remove the responsibility from the victims and rather look at the other factors that are impacting them. And what we've been finding with like domestic violence is that in some cases, the abusers also view themselves as like victims, and in a way they are. And so we also need to make sure that we can get them the support they need to break out from the cycles of like violence. And I 100% think that that can happen through like the underlying like data reporting system, and also through the collaboration between the different layers.
Thank you very much. You gave me goosebumps. Very important statement, and thinking about removing the blame from the victims. Because in all of the times, you know, we hear people saying like, you shouldn't have texted with this guy, or you shouldn't have taken those pictures to begin with, or, you know, you should have paid attention to how you wear and how you dressed. You know, you weren't careful enough how you phrase things on the internet, on Twitter. So, you know, there's a lot of victim blaming. It's a major challenge for many experiencing cyber violence. And I'm actually wondering, how does this impact people affected? And what do we have to change in our society to stop blaming those affected? What do you think, Sonia?
I think having conversations like these, because I feel like it's a bit under wraps now, even in general, the terminology used for cyber violence, it still hasn't been fully defined. And I think the more conversations we have, the more stories we share, we can then start building real solutions. I think, just to add on to both Christina and Eleanor's comments, I think one key thing is also designing apps that make a woman feel safe, which, to be honest, I think the reason why I'm exploring cybersecurity in general and taking courses now on it is because I feel so unsafe using the technology that I'm on. So it's having a bit more of a woman's focus when designing technology too, which I think should be incorporated in the conversation.
Absolutely. And what do you think would make for a safe technology? Like what give us maybe a couple of examples on that? And how do you think that we can remove the blame from the victims?
Well, I think, for example, I'm a huge advocate of blockchain architecture just because I feel like my identity is secure on it, and kind of understanding the different pathways where my data is going. I think, again, it's just, rather than have like a 10-page terms of use, it should be very clear and succinct where my data is going. Something simple and clear like that, because I feel like that creates a bit of mud and confusion to people when they're entering these apps and they don't actually know where their data is going. Then the other thing is just cyber hygiene, which it's advocating for more security around what you're doing. So we have the multi-factor authentication. I think that's entered more of the more public discourse than before. I think that just makes a person understand, okay, my content, what I'm entering into whatever application is in a safe space. And I think, you know, in working with victims of sexual abuse, like in real life, the one thing that we look to build is a safe space. So I think translating that into applications would also, from my perspective, and I think if we could gather consensus on that, would be to advocate for a safe space on different applications.
I would also like to add to that most technology today, it's designed to hijack our attention, and it's designed to sell our data to advertisers. But we can really rethink how that technology is designed. So with us, we're really trying to design it from the user perspective and needs. So for instance, with Bright Act, one big problem with domestic violence is that there is a lot of control involved on the abuser, controlling the victim, where the victim's phone or device might be under control. And so it's really challenging for the victim to actually collect data that could hold up in court, because some of the people we've been speaking to, they might have had 15 phones over the course of 2 years, because they're just constantly being taken from them or skimmed through or controlled. So the way that we've solved that is that we are not storing data on the app, but we're storing it in an external server that's also end-to-end encrypted and secure, so that whenever you enter our app or our application, you can never see that it's been used. So there are no traces of usage in it. So if a perpetrator actually logs in, then you can never know what the person has reported, and you can never see what has been going on, which is a way to actually protect the victim, which helps them feel more secure and safe, as well as providing them education and providing them access to help within one like platform. And I think that's something when we design technology, can become a lot better at. And also giving the user full control over how their data is used. So enabling you to erase your data, enabling you to share your data with like scientific research, like we're connecting in like researchers right now, or like sharing it like anonymously, but really have full control over your like data, like trailways, like Sonia was saying. I think it's so key.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one thing that you mentioned that was very, very important, and it's how the systems are designed in a way. I remember I was in a talk actually last year at a big event, Republica, I think, and it was a designer who is and now working for Mozilla, but anyway, she made a very, very specific research on designing of social media design systems. And she specifically pointed out that when it comes to those systems, it's very easy for all of us to make it either fully accessible or fully private. So either you are searchable by everyone can see your photos, or no one can see anything. So there's not as a way that you can actually create your own protection. And I think it's a systemic, sort of a systemic design flaw. I would assume Christina has a very different opinion when it comes to systems design, and also how we can help those victims stop blaming themselves. Christina, what is your opinion so far?
I have a very easy answer. Like, I know I'm all for this design discussion, very important, especially between women. But first of all, how to take the blame of them is to take them seriously, and just to believe in what they say and why they speak to you. That's like that's where it starts, and it starts with places like like when you go to the police, when you look for different ways to help you and people don't believe you. That's really a frustrating experience that is very long outstanding phenomena in women violence. We don't even need the internet for that. And I think that actually, if we look on the way discourse is happening and things are changing, Me Too has brought a lot of change and has really brought visibility to this need of women to be taken seriously. But it still is a hard fight, and it still is a hard fight for not those ones who have strong visibility, but those ones who are insecure and who don't know so much, and who are actually also don't know a lot about their data. I can tell you that women, if they are abused by spy apps by maybe their partner, they will just buy a new app, they will just buy a new phone. So they're constantly buying new phone, and they don't understand that the spy app is actually there. Like why does he know where I am, and all these kind of things. So yeah, to take them seriously and to say, I think something is wrong here, and actually to have a place where you can get checked. Do I have spyware on my phone? That'll be kind of measures, small measures that I see that we have to bring technology and the people together again, and disability. And I know also we have so great women solidarity here, and we have a great network that helps women in abuse and violent situations, but they are not fit. They don't know anything about digitalization, so they stand in front of all these problems, who are part of the design problems, and just have a practical moment that they have the phone and they have the woman and they have the problem, but they don't know how to handle between these three. Just a question. I see all here these nice questions from people coming in. Are you going to take them, Elena, or?
That's exactly what I was planning to do. There's a lot of really good questions, and I wanted to start with one that it's very fitting to this conversation now. Also, Eleanor made that comment about you know, how abusers can also be the victims in the situations as well. So should we protect the data of accused abusers as well? So in countries with a history of unbalanced criminalization of minorities like the US, how big is the danger that this data could be abused? That is a question coming from Marco. Thank you very much, Marco. Who would like to answer this?
I think I could take a stab at it, just because I think for those who are accused of cyber violence, especially places like the US, especially because they're minority groups, there's this concept called intersectionality, which is this interplay between identity politics and socioeconomic conditions which drive violence. So in essence, these people also need help. So in terms of protecting these abusers or, protecting the data, I think these are also cases that need help as well. So looking at it from who are the different parties involved in this act of violence, the victim, the accuser, and really, dissecting their mental health issues, because that's actually what lies beneath all of this, and how they use technology as a way to perpetuate more violence.
The way that we are working with it, we're beginning to approach it from like the domestic violence perspective to help the victims of domestic violence. But then our plan is actually to build multiple apps. So we're going to take the app that we have and that infrastructure and like replicate it to build out to help solve like different societal problems. So we'll start with one like for the victims. We're going to make one for children and teenagers because they have different needs than what adults would have. We would have one that would be for the abuser. So that would look more into the psychology of violence and teaching them to learn like the triggers and the context where like abusive behavior might emerge, and also to learn to recognize in which cases they are like abusers, in which cases they might be victims, and how those correlate with one another, and where they can also seek help, and taking down the shame of like seeking help. The fourth one we're going to do will be targeting human trafficking and sex workers to help them with their like specific needs. After this panel, I think it's going to be quite obvious that we're going to need to make a cyberviolence app as well to help like the victims of like cyberviolence and like with the reporting that they need. But I think what one needs to keep in mind is to always to design from the need of the person and recognize that there are multiple user journeys, and like figuring out how you can layer like the different needs from the different stakeholders. So for here you have like victims, you have like perpetrators, you also have like the municipalities and the county governments, you have the NGOs, you have like shelters, you have like authorities, there are like psychologists, there are lawyers. So it's a very complex map and a very complex system that one needs to put together to get the full picture. And then also looking at the different nuances in cultures between many different between like many different countries, because there's no one way of like dealing with like violence. And I think especially with cyber violence, it is a transnational problem, which I also think it's why it's hard to actually pass laws on it that actually adheres across borders. And this is a big challenge with like technology and how one actually can work with that. So maybe then in like Germany, that can be kind of this role model and this pioneer in how you work with certain issues that maybe some other country later can adopt. But we need more brave countries like that to step forward to actually protect like the victims, and being able to distinguish between the different forms of data using scientific research, I would say, and really learning from the experts.
Christina, what do you think?
Well, we had a lot of discussion about this law, whether this is a nice example for everyone or not. I have a difficulty because I also, when the law came up, I was also invited to America, and then like to present and to say, hey, how is it going? And I'm kind of thinking if this was such a good move, because I told you that I think now we have this law here, and in France there's also movements, and we will have it very soon, probably having it on a European level of discussion. One person here asked in the chat that maybe gives a bit of a hint, that like what's with photos, like you post them, should you block all these photos? And I'm a big fan of community control over these kind of content that is not so easy maybe also to say about, okay, for example, in Germany we have a nudist culture, and yeah, the breastfeeding, everything is actually quite tolerant, and we know that on Facebook, because we have a policy that is obviously made, it comes from somehow Silicon Valley and some very prudent approach of like some concept of idea of a naked body that doesn't go conform with maybe what we culturally here think is acceptable. And here we are exactly in this gray scales, and how do we handle it? And I think it's very important we have a very high community control. And this community, if communities take over their content, and if they control and the content themselves in a kind of idea that they do it, not people in the Philippines who are kind of dealing with the kind of communicative garbage that we create here, but we kind of put it here and make it our work, then we can eventually also come to secure rooms and secure ways of communication. That doesn't touch data or anything, but it kind of goes on the question of, okay, we have technology, but there's people behind it, and if we make rooms secure and people watch each other, then we will also not have such a high violent appearance. And this is kind of also what is my research on, that I ask myself, okay, how can we not do content, like if it's on Facebook or on YouTube or all these platforms, they have their policy and they will have people removing it, or AI removing it, which is another design discussion of AI. How does it kind of take hashes and take certain things out and block it? But my question is also that, like, how can we make people like own their space and make it their space and make it a safe space? And that's like kind of comes from this feminist, actually second generation at least, to say, okay, we need maybe our safe space as women to meet and together in order to discuss certain thing or to empower us. So kind of I'm working on this idea. How does social media, how can it be coming back to creating their own spaces and not kind of to outsource it? That would be also my idea about pictures. So if we find pictures that are not, we don't think that are appropriate, we remove them, or we discuss, do we want to remove them or not? But we don't do it on a neutral base. We have a common discussion culture on that.
Yeah, because I mean, removing them would not stop the problem, right? And actually, I would argue here that it's not only about someone posting pictures of you online. It's also about, because right now the technology is so advanced that you can even Photoshop someone, right? And even if their picture is not them, you can, because you want to, as I think someone mentioned, revenge porn, or you just broke up with your ex-girlfriend and you're angry, either release their pictures, or maybe someone who's angry with someone without even having any connection, just creating a fake one, a fake image, and then putting it online. So it's not that much even the picture, is the significance of it and the violence that it creates, right? The sort of crossing boundaries.
And can I maybe just say one more example is, if somebody creates on your name, Elena, an account in Facebook, even if you don't want to be there and you want it removed because that account creates hate speech or all kind of racism under your name, you have to send your data off to Facebook in order to release it, to say, I am that person and that account is not me. And that is data-wise totally fragile and not right. Because why do I have to send in my data in order to make it release, and to say that somebody's actually abusing my name there in the internet? That is stuff that I feel that we have to negotiate also power-wise.
Exactly. Yes, I also happen to know people that had the same issue. Other people would just make their Facebook profile stealing all of their data, and then you just get also in an emotional journey trying to prove that this is you and it's not someone else. But I suppose a question following up on this is, like, how can we advise municipalities to do something? Because we're talking about law and we're coming back to legal actions. What can civil society do to protect us? How can they support us when it comes to online sexual abuse or harassment? Okay, silence. Are you expecting me to ask one of specific? Okay. Well, Sonia, what is your opinion here? You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry. I think the approach to this is understanding that, again, this is multi-party, not a multi-party, like multi-sector approach, and that cyber violence is the result of a flaw in the way that technology has been designed. And this also translates into a human rights issue. And I think that's why we can draw in the community and municipalities to understand that and draw the relation between this being a violation of human rights. That's essentially my only thinking. I'm still kind of thinking in the background, how do we approach this from engaging with civil society? That's all I have for now. If I have more, I'll come back.
Eleanor, what do you think?
I think one of the ways to do it, which is what we're doing with BrightEye, which is what I said before, is really to allow for the stories and like the cases to be gathered in like one place and then show it as a form of like data, like support for the municipalities and like the government, so they can understand how prevalent that it is, and then also make this like analysis of how it impacts the rest of the society. Because if someone does not feel safe in their life, then how can they be a contributing like citizen to the rest of the economy, like looking at like overall health, like looking at like stress, like looking at there's like psychological distress, like looking at however you interact in all your different forms of like relationships. I also agree with like Sonia that I think it's a flaw in how the technology is designed, and I think we could follow on like rules and laws and like legislations that, for instance, the EU has passed, like with the GDPR, but one could make it even more specific to actually make laws that would enforce social media and like certain internet providers and like corporations to actually need to provide certain features that would protect their like specific victims. Because just having a like reporting function and then not knowing what happens with it might not be enough, because we see quite a lot of cyber violence. And it was actually quite interesting for me, because when I got invited to this, I've actually had multiple very strange people reach out to me on Instagram, and I don't know if there's like algorithms somehow intertwined with like ANNA NACKT or what, but I've never had people before like, you know, asking if they want to be like my sugar daddy, or people sending me these like sexual like naked like approaches, and I got quite a lot of those afterwards. So I think one of the ways would also then be to looking into how the algorithms are formed and like rhythm, and like what kind of like feedback loops we actually create in this technology. And given that most technology is created by men today, I do think that the authorities also needs to be educated using like the data support, so they can know what the issues are, because not all of them are that knowledgeable about tech. I mean, of course, some people know quite a lot, but I would say in the general sense, they don't. And there's so much transition and change that happens within this field that we need some kind of system to help like educate and help like giving the statistical like data to actually help pass laws that will help protect like citizens, which is challenging to do, but getting more women into tech, I think it's one of those ways, like long-term, like educating like women so they can start coding, so they can start doing UX design, so they can work with cybersecurity. I think all those like initiatives are great, but then also looking into how we as companies can become more like mindful and like designing ways to actually inform the like authorities in ways that would be beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's about data bias in a way as well. So is what it's if the systems that we use are designed by someone that does not understand our story or our narrative or how we interact with them, then how can they serve us? And if the data that they import in the systems to actually inform them, if it doesn't include any of our truth, then how can you protect us? There is, I guess, like, I'm curious to, because I know also from Eleanor that you're specifically at the beginning focused on domestic abuse, so more of the offline sense of harassment. I'm curious, there's a question here from Richard asking the correlation between online and offline harassment. So in countries that there's is there like higher level of domestic violence equals also more online harassment? Is there any data that would support that? Or is it more like online could see high levels in countries with low domestic violence in the real world? Is there any correlation there that you heard of, or anyone else here in the panelists that know anything about this?
I would not be able to answer about those correlations because I have not myself looked at those like correlations. But what we can see with the types of violence that we've been looking at is that in general, there's a big gap between the amount of reporting in like different countries. So the data in general is very biased. For instance, with domestic violence, less than 40% of like women like report like domestic violence. And it's partly because they don't believe that something is going to happen, because they don't feel heard or seen, because they don't think they will get the support like that they help, that they might need. There's also cultural bias where like their families or communities might say, well, yeah, but this is normal. Like, and so that's kind of what we're up against. And so we think that by creating systems where it becomes easier to find the help you need, and it becomes easier to document and like report in a safe way, then we can also help bring up those numbers. So right now we are looking together with like scientific like researchers on how we can actually start looking into like the data reporting of like domestic violence, which then also could like include like cyber violence. We're right now building the world's first like data visualization on like domestic violence. Like nothing like this exists, which I just think is absolutely crazy. Like there's no place where you can see real-time data on like domestic violence. Like the only data you can get are these reports. Like we were looking at the EU, and the latest report that we found on an aggregated level was from 2014. Which was encompassing all countries. So we're also dealing with data that's not even up to date. And I think that's a big, big issue. And so I would not be able or even dare to speak on the correlations between offline and online violence, but my guess would be that they might be correlated because I would say it would result back to the amount of like respect you have within the society, and it goes back to values and the level of like discrimination, the level of like equality, also the level of stress on a society, because we've seen with our statistics, which is also why there's been an increase in like domestic violence now during Corona. The more stress and the more economic stress you have on a society, the more violence you tend to see as well. And so those are quite obvious mechanisms, but I don't know between the offline and online, but maybe someone else knows.
Christina, you want to add a comment?
There is some studies about, but not on women violence, but on violence in particularly with right-wing extremists in East Germany, and the correlation of if they didn't have internet for 5 days through a structural program, and research found out that actually in these 5 days we had less hate speech online. Of course, it correlates, but it's very hard to do a scientific proof. And I also agree with Eleanor that these numbers, like that there needs to be definitely more enforcement, and we need to know more what is happening there. And the data, for example, that the law, the Network Enforcement Act, actually pushes out certain reporting that we can see, okay, certain things have been reported, like certain matters, but here is actually the question also to focus on women or on gender-based violence that is kind of not there. And that's sad, because I think we need numbers and we need more clarity. But I would also say, like you, I can only tell you a few research here and there that probably it will be true.
And a question addressed to you, Christina, from Savi. I realize that community control can provide advantages in terms of cultural differences and identities, like a positive result in Germany. But would it also apply to states with a patriarchal culture where that community involvement may actually fuel oppression and restrict intercultural growth?
Yeah, I saw that, and thank you for that question. It's very interesting because I think that, of course, social networks have community standards, and they are actually, even though a lot of people don't act upon them, they are like a democratic guideline, and they actually protect also women from being discriminated in order as a group. So the question is more, how can communities actually use technology and use social media or chats in order to bring back to say, actually, this is not according to community standards or to the rules that we agreed upon here in this networks. It's efforts, but I can also tell you from Germany that there is huge digital civil society that really focuses on supporting and empowering people who've been affected from hate speech. Sexist hate speech can be one of them, and they come then maybe into your group or in your attack, and they just like write messages and support you and take you seriously, as you said, with your concern. And that can be also very empowering moment, not to feel so lost and alone in that form of violence that might have gone against you. So it's a question more for digital civil society to be mobile and to be alert and to get together to get that going. And then you can also, of course, break up patriarchal structures that are there.
I see that we are, thank you very much for your answer, Christina. So I see that we are actually almost running over time. My instinct would say, let's continue with some of the questions here that I see from the audience and final statements, but it's up to you if you're on a tight schedule and you would like to wrap it up on time. If that's okay, I will just ask the questions that I see here, because I think it's important that everybody who's here all of their questions should be answered. Actually, Claudio, I see that he posted his question twice. One was about what do the police do if cyber harassment is reported, with accompanying evidence quite easily obtained from the online sources? Because for me, it's the most logical immediate solution, but I spoke to a few women who complain about cyber harassment against them, but they did not go to the police in the end. Maybe some role models on some kind of Me Too movement, but for cyberbullying harassment, charity groups. I think this goes back to what you were saying, actually, Christina, that basically we need to create this form of community where people feel that they have a safe space. Because I think that's why a lot of people are not going to the police, because they're afraid. Any comments on that, Sonia?
No, I agree with that approach. Also, the focus on community rather than just adding to Christina's point, focus on that. And as I mentioned before earlier, is having these public conversations so that this is how the Me Too movement started anyway. Even for me, coming out with my own trauma, it started by seeing other examples of these conversations happening, and then slowly but surely you build that builds empowerment. So I think this is the way forward. This is how to continue using this approach, focus on communities and conversations. But I also think it's something not to be taken lightly, because I actually have just recently been exposed to this, and just doing research and finding that there's gaps and holes and not enough information on this. And we've been actively using social media and technology for years now. It's just alarming. So I think, this should be the way forward, that we actually include this in not only policy, but just in public discourse within the community. So just continuing to add on to Christina's points.
That's important.
I think one of the big issues is that it's not yet shameful to conduct cyber violence, or at least that's my perception of it. And some of the advice that we got with domestic violence was that one of the things that really worked well in the UK, in their public campaigns, was actually making domestic violence a shameful act to do. Because when you start putting that peer pressure around, coming from the communities, and when you start having other people call you out on it, that's when it becomes really effective. I don't know if I am myself seeing that kind of shame around cyber violence. I'm also a bit new to the topic, but in my personal experiences, I haven't quite noticed too many examples of, for instance, men speaking out about it. I'm often hearing more of my female friends talking about it, maybe because they're also the victims of it, but it's not a general discussion yet, and it's not quite like I said, a shameful act to do, which I definitely think it should be.
Yes, agreed. Christina, would you like to add a comment on this?
No, and I'm actually a bit. I'm sorry that it's 6:30, and I told you that I am in this. I have a small baby and trying to manage, so we have a bit more time. But
that's okay.
I would leave the conversation soon.
Okay, I'm wrapping it up now. So last comment perhaps from all of you on our discussion today. I think we can just go for hours. So perhaps if you can just make a last comment, something that we can look for the future in a positive light. I think even having these very tough discussions are very important for us to evolve and to definitely change things. Christina, what would be your last remark? Or closing remark?
Don't give up and take people seriously. And yeah, help, support, empower. It's not so hard. And for women to go into technology and technology designing, and this, we didn't speak so much about it, but also I see all this AI coming in that again has a gender bias that is not working well for women who are affected by violence, because it's not thought of, because men mostly design it. So that's kind of my 3 points.
Thank you. Sonia, last remarks, and maybe you also would like to give a comment on the thoughts on the use of AI avatars to seduce and trap potential sex offenders.
I think I was also reading that question. I think that is just, it's a temporary fix, and it also just adds more core design on top of an already flawed design. So I don't agree with that. I think it just needs to be inherently changed. And to add on to a few points, I think it's also because I'm living in the US right now, and Black Lives Matter is happening. And it's a beautiful thing to see when you're pressuring the systems around you around an issue that has just been under the carpet for so long. So I think to that, I also now feel propelled to do that with cyber violence, because it is just an extension of gender-based violence and violence against women and girls in real life. So I think pressure on systems needs to happen. And with that, I also, as my specific focus is how to overcome cultural bias when designing these new systems. So those are my 3 points, and I hope they're clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Eleanor, it would be great to hear your last thoughts. And also, there's a question here: where is Bride Act active?
We are active in Sweden. We're a Swedish company. Right now, we're working with a municipality in Sweden as our pilot city, and then also in contact with the national government. We will quite soon be scaling to other parts of the world, so we really see ourselves as a global solution. We're getting quite a lot of support within Europe because of our participation in the EU versus virus hackathon. Some of the likely countries we're going to go to after Sweden would be Germany, probably. We're getting quite a lot of traction and support there. Could also be Italy. We're also getting quite a lot of people reaching out to us there. Now we're in discussions with the US as well. I've lived in the US for 7 years, and there's also quite a lot of organizations there looking at domestic violence. We're in contact with different organizations in India, also had Tanzania reach out to us, South Africa, and now also Iraq. So those countries all have very different needs. So we're right now looking at how we can work on a base level to support everyone, while also customizing support within the different countries and cities that we go to. My final remarks would be, I think on the community end, for us as a community to spot the early signals of domestic violence. And I think that would go back to education, like Christina mentioned, that we can all make an effort to actually learn more about cyber violence and being able to spot when other people are subject to it. So we can actually step in and ask if we can help support them in any way. Because I think the more eyes we have on this and the more understanding and knowledge we have on the topic, the better support system we will have as well. Because I think in these issues, it's quite easy to feel isolated and alone and not knowing what to do. And so one shouldn't disregard those close relationships coming from family, friends, and neighbors, but then also taking responsibility, looking at a higher level, of course, too. But that's at least one action point that I will take after this call.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. It was very important to have this conversation. And Alina, I would leave the last remarks to you. Thank you all panelists for coming. It was very much a pleasure to host this conversation and to think about these topics and how we can overcome them. And thank you all for doing actually what you're doing. You're all doing amazing things in your own way. So thanks very much for putting up the good fight. So Alina, please, thank you very much as well, and give us a closing remarks.
Thank you so much. First of all, I second what Elena said, and I also specifically want to say, Christina, if you have to run off, please feel free to do so. We can catch up any point later. I also just really wanted to say thank you. There are just so many notes that I took at the same time on things I was like, oh, that's a great quote. That's something I don't want to forget. The question I asked in the beginning was, or basically the quote of the web is not working for women and girls. I guess one of the answers I got from this here now is it's because women and girls are not involved in how the web is designed, and they are not being taken seriously about things that are happening on the web. So it's actually, that is, in my opinion, one of the answers. I really, really loved the idea that came from the audience on the let's have a Me Too digital version. And that is something I'm going to take as an action point with me. What I wanted to add to that, having been at the police station reporting cyber violence myself, I just also want to bring one more perspective, which is that I think we also have to mobilize resources. And that goes back to what Christina said in the beginning, that often the police just doesn't have the resources to deal with these cases because there are presumably more important things happening. And yeah, so I guess that is just also back to the very first question. We have a law, but we actually have to enforce it. And we as a community have to make sure that we can actually enforce it and that we help each other enforcing that law. So with that, thank you so much. Have a very, very good rest of the evening and let's speak soon. Bye, guys.